Talk about the importance of this exhibit in this museum, in this city, at this time.
For me, the first thing that I learned once this exhibit was installed was that Thomas Jefferson had 600 people enslaved.
At his
now,
home.
before this exhibit was installed, I knew a bit about Sally Hemings, but I did not know about 600 people. So for me, the importance is that I now have 599 other people whose spirits I can pray for.
Mm-hmm. Whose names you might
whose
know?
Names might have known, yes,
yeah.
or as they can be used as a source of strength to draw from the ancestors.
Yeah.
So those things, for me, make this exhibit very, very important.
You know, we're going to go inside in a little and look at some of the detail. I took a walk through and a couple things jumped out at me. One is the detail in there about the families, and slavery had an effect on those families. Their
yes.
ability to stay together, the ability to grow, the ability to remember. This exhibit does a really good job of trying to put some of that back together where it got broken many centuries ago.
Yes, and that is incredibly important because in many instances that was the motivation for one person to escape and go to another plantation because one of their loved ones had been sold away. Mm-hmm. Or because they had heard about an impending sale. Mm-hmm. So that was reason, well, you know, we can't stay together, let's all escape. And many that may have been sold to another plantation, they would escape and try to go and find their loved ones.
Mm-hmm. So this is a pretty typical example of the exhibits inside the exhibit. These family trees, which give you such a really detailed picture of the people, the actual people, and how they related to one another on the plantation. This, of course, is the Hemings family, which is kind of the center of all of that.
Yes, yes. And this one, I always say it's really, really informative. Mm-hmm. I have tried 2 or 3 times to follow it. I get lost every time. But it is still really, really interesting and important.
Yeah, okay. Let's go see more.
Okay.
So here we are finally at the statue of Thomas Jefferson. And this is one of the more controversial parts of the exhibit. But when you get here and see what's really going on, I think the context is really important.
I have spoken with people who have come here with the intention of being irritated, of being angry, despite what they see. And therefore, you don't really learn as much as you possibly can. People come here and they only see the statue. For me, 600 names. At the very top, as it says, remembering those enslaved. 600 names.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of, I mean, the visual here is that this statue of the 3rd president of the United States is surrounded by these names of the people he owned. I mean, there's something very powerful about just the imagery itself.
Exactly. Even though we have here is only 600 names, I like to imagine if each one of those names had a child and they had a child and that wall was expanded, mm-hmm. ultimately Jefferson would be completely hidden.
Yes.
And for me, that is an example of how unimportant he is to this exhibit about Sally Hemings and those people who were enslaved on those many plantations.
I think the exhibit, as all of the exhibits that we hope to present at the Wright, presents a variety of different access points and stories. This one happens to be grounded in Jefferson's Monticello, but it talks about everything from the Sally Hemings story, the enslaved people of Monticello, the artisans that created it, and then also gets into the issues of Jefferson's paradox, as they call it, in the exhibit of having tried to reconcile in his mind how it was that he had 600, 900 enslaved people, mm-hmm. and yet also is the author of the Declaration of Independence. So, you know, the exhibit, I think, for us, just allows us, you know, the exhibit is just a starting point for the discussions that we have at the Wright. There are a number of other talks and conversations that we have, public programs, et cetera. So all of our exhibits are designed to raise a variety of different issues that can be further investigated and discussed in that context. So I think it's important because it just raises a number of very complex, very difficult and challenging issues of which people should rightly agree and disagree about. Right.
So Dr. House, before we get to your point of view here, I want to note that you were unable to even go into the exhibit because you feel so strongly about your objections to it. So tell us what that objection is.
It's not just my objections. Mm-hmm. It's the fact that our coalition is actually boycotting mm-hmm. this exhibit. Mm-hmm. And so as a representative of that coalition, I wouldn't want to go into the exhibit, and I wouldn't want to lead people to think, oh, it's okay. Mm-hmm. You know, we're calling for boycott of, but it's okay if I go in. No, no. Our coalition has been involved with or expressing opposition to this exhibit long before it came. Mm-hmm. When we learned it was going to be brought here, we started to try to get to the museum board and say, no, this is a mistake. This isn't representative of what Dr. Wright envisioned when he fought so hard to found this museum. And we felt that it was a really sad use of limited museum funds to invest in bringing this museum. We think that this exhibit, we think the exhibit seeks to falsify the reality of slavery on the Monticello plantation by sort of wiping out all of the terror and violence that would have been necessary to keep 600 enslaved people working and laboring from sun up to sundown. We know that our people were ingenious, that they were creative, that they invented things, that they learned ways to endure the hardship, right? But this was a miserable life for them, and it's a falsification of their experience to have an exhibit like this that just whitewashes all of that reality out of it.
So it's hard to tell a book by its cover, right? And it feels like to me that the coalition critiques an exhibit that is not here. And I had Dr. House and her coalition taken the time to see the exhibit, and I understand your boycotting and why you would want to do that. You would notice that the right, knowing the audience and the place that we are in, did in fact reimagine this exhibit for Detroit. And one example of it is a simple tombstone that you see here that does not appear in any other representation of this exhibit anywhere, as well as the enslaved ancestors. That is the first images that you see when you come into this exhibit. It's about the enslaved people of Monticello. There's no question about that. You don't encounter Jefferson until 2/3 of the way through. And I think this was a response to some of the critique that the coalition was bringing forward.
We have to remember that Sally Hemings was a child, 12, 13, 14 at the most, when President Jefferson decided that she was going to be the bearer of his children. Some people say 6 children, some say 7. I know that one child didn't survive. So nowadays we would call Jefferson, President Jefferson, an enslaver and a pedophile, right? People are going to prison in our current society for being pedophiles, right? Yet we are willing, in this one institution that celebrates African American history, we are willing to bring in images of this kind of person.
And say hello to our contributors, Stephen Henderson of WDET and American Black Journal, and Nolan Finley of the Detroit News. It is good to see both of you here. And coming out of that conversation, Stephen, that you had, first taking us through the exhibit, and then really hearing the passion on both sides. And when you think about art and when you think about exhibits like this, really kind of evoking those kind of emotions on both sides.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the point of a museum like this, the point of exhibits like this, is to make people think, and maybe make them think in a way that's different than the way they thought before, and provoke some discussion and maybe debate and maybe some argument. There are people who don't agree with that about this particular exhibit. They think it's rendered in a way that glorifies a slaveholder and doesn't show enough of the brutality of the lives that those slaves lived. They also feel like the community didn't have enough say. over whether this exhibit would come here or what it would look like. And I think those are all very valid points of view. But I do think if you go through the exhibit and see the thought that was put into it, it's hard to level those kinds of criticisms against it. I mean, it really does show an important part of the life of the slaves who lived at the Jefferson's plantation.
And that's really where the exhibit starts.
And that's where it starts.
And then it makes its way to Thomas Jefferson. Nolan?
Well, Steve and I were talking before the show. I mean, the truth is complex, and this talk about more enlightened and benevolent slaveholders somehow, or in some contexts, that's even worse than the brutal slave owners, because these people knew better. They knew they were dealing with spiritual human beings. I told the story about my hometown. There's a place called the Old Mulkey Meeting House where there was a community of slaveholders and slaves all attended the same church, and the slaves could bring their grievances against their owners to the church. They couldn't go to the court of law, but they could go to the church, and people say, well, this was, these were very enlightened people. I think they were worse because they knew better. They knew they were dealing with human beings and still enslaved them, still treated them as beasts of burden.
I think it's interesting, though, to take a larger look at the role that this museum plays in this community, in Detroit and in our area, about sparking those kinds of conversations that we should be having about our past.
Yeah, I think we should. Dr. Gloria House, who is the person who represented the opposing view in the interview, did make a great point, though. She said this, before the museum was opened in Washington, the Smithsonian African American Museum, this was the only museum of its kind in the country, and so it does occupy a pretty sacred space for people in the city, for African Americans around the country, and I think I could certainly feel a sense of offended sensibility on her part because of that this was not a community decision to do this. I think they feel left out, and they feel disrespected.
But this is not a museum that has taken slavery lightly. I mean, this has not been afraid to show the brutality of the slave trade. I mean, their original exhibit when they opened was just jarring. So, I mean, they should have earned the right to take different perspectives and to walk out on a limb a little bit.
And this is a temporary exhibit, though. Have they talked about how many people have come through and what the reaction really has been from the community?
There's an incredible number of people filing through here, and they have a board right behind Nolan over there where they've asked people to leave comments. It is full of things that people have written down about their reactions to this exhibit.